Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Rebecca Orr, who is here today to share with us the story of the loss of her husband Lance and the dangers of being overtired on the job. Rebecca, thank you for agreeing to share your story with us today. It obviously can't be an easy thing for you to do.
Thank you for having me. Glad I could be here.
Let's start our discussion, Rebecca, with you telling us about your husband Lance and what life was like prior to the day he was killed on the job.
Lance and I met when we were teens. We were in the same youth group together out here in a small country church in Alberta. We're best friends to begin with. He was someone that loved the great outdoors. He loved hunting and fishing and spending time with family and friends, and family was really important to him. We got married in July 1st of 2006. And so at the time we hadn't even been married 3 years yet. And so there's a lot of growing pains in those first couple of years of marriage. And we were both super young at the time as well. But he was someone that would just give his shirt off his back for anybody. He's someone that would stop and help people who needed it, would offer his truck if anybody needed it. And so, which was something I admired about him for sure, but also something that could drive a person mad at the same time too. He was a workaholic. He loved his job. He loved what he did. And so work often tend to come first a lot of the time, which for a young married couple is really hard to adjust to, and get used to. And I would say about 6 months, probably leading up, to the incident, was probably the best 6 months of our marriage, which was really nice to have that memory, into play as well. So, but yeah, he had a very gentle nature to him. He was wonderful to be around. People wanted to be around him. He adored my family and wanted to be around my family, and it was something that obviously drew me to him for sure.
So what did your husband do as an occupation?
My husband was a construction worker. He was a rigger, and so his job was to load things up to cranes and then let the crane operator know when it was time to move the load. And so he loved his job. He moved around the industry quite easily and was well liked, and people wanted him on their crews.
Did he ever talk, or did you ever have a discussion about safety on the job? Was it anything that ever came up?
No, not really. I mean, you never think things are going to happen to you, right? I mean, there was always, I shouldn't say always, there were close calls, or there was incidents, maybe not necessarily on his site, but around the industry, around the construction industry. But you never think it's going to happen to you. And so anytime I did go, oh, wait a second, he was very quick to kind of just brush it off. I mean, he was one of the safest people that I knew. And so, as much as any construction workers really, aren't a fan of safety officers or whatever, Lance was very, he would never put himself or anybody else at risk. Like, he was very confident in what he did. And so I never really had a reason to fear or have a reason to think that it could happen, to us at all. So no, it never really came up in discussion, or you never really think about it until it actually does happen to you, and it completely changes your whole perspective.
So tell us what happened the day that he died on the job.
So if anybody has lived in Alberta, we had every sort of weather you could imagine that day, oddly enough. We had rain, snow, sleet, you name it, we had it. That particular morning, I had almost had him convinced not to go in to work that day. But at the last second, he decided he should, because he didn't want to leave the crane operator hanging, who was a really close friend of his. And he thought that if they could get everything done that day, he could leave early that day, and be home. And so, my understanding of what happened, and obviously through the years, my memories have, trauma does that to you. But what had happened is they had loaded a load of huge concrete forms, into a sling. And for whatever reason that day, Lance used two different lengths of chains, and then he didn't tie down the load properly. And so when he gave the crane operator the okay to move the load that day, the load shifted in the air. And for whatever reason, which really the only person that can answer all those questions isn't here, Lance was walking directly under the load, instead of around the load. And so when the load shifted in the air and came crashing down, it caught him at the back of his neck. And so it would have killed him instantly. He wouldn't have known what even had hit him. Which of course, in the meantime, leaves pandemonium on a job site. Those concrete slabs aren't small. They are huge concrete slabs. And so obviously it would have made quite a ruckus, and it would have shook the building when they fell. And so yeah, he wouldn't have even known what had hit him at the time.
Now, you mentioned when you do your presentations the fact that your husband had been working long hours just before the accident.
Yes.
How tired was he at that time?
That's a great question. I would say very. I remember my mom, it wasn't even just the weeks leading up to the incident. It had been months leading up to the incident. The guys had been working 14 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And again, alarm bells, but not alarm bells. It is what it is. It's a part of the industry. You don't give it much thought. But I remember my mom finding a photo of him from, I think it was Christmas of 2007, I think it was, to Christmas of 2008, I think it was. And he looked like a very completely different person. He didn't look like the same guy. He was tired. He was irritable. Wasn't thinking clearly, which was so unlike him. But again, you don't really think much of it until after the fact. But yeah, it had been months and weeks. He definitely wasn't his normal self, for sure. And he definitely, was a lot more on edge, and was a lot more, and even the day of the incident, things weren't going the way, like I didn't normally talk to him while he was at work. And that day I did end up talking to him a little bit that day. And even that day, things weren't going, obviously due to the weather and multiple reasons, but weather being one of them. Things weren't going the way that he had hoped they were. And so he was quite irritated and agitated that things weren't going smoothly, and was still hoping that he could get off and that the job could be done that day. And so there was a sense of rushing, and a sense of getting things out of the way, and a sense of frustration and exhaustion, and all that plays into, ultimately, someone losing their lives, and multiple lives being forever altered.
So at the time of the accident, you were 6 months pregnant. The whole period must have seemed surreal to you. What was it like?
So the day that I found out, I actually was doing a baby registry. And so I was actually at a Toys R Us, in the city, like in Calgary, with a friend when I got the call, from the cops when they were looking for me. And to be really honest, I don't really remember a lot of that time period. My body, I guess, shock and trauma will do that to a person. Kind of went into shutdown mode, and it became an automatic sense of survival, and not only a survival for myself, but a survival for our child, as well. I was young, right? Lance was only 27 and I was only 25. And so to suddenly think that you have your whole life mapped out, right? You're excited for your first child. You had just got married. A baby was on the way that was going to drastically change your life in general. Suddenly was left reeling that I was on this on my own, and having to rebuild from the ground up everything that you thought you had already built. And so it was it was a lot. I don't have a lot of solid memories of that time. It was a survival mode. I had a baby I had to keep alive, and then, that I had to keep her alive on the outside. And then I had a toddler to take care of. And then I had to, right. And so it just compiled, on top of me, and being young, and you're not going to find a whole lot of widows that are 25, and you're not going to find a community as well, of people who understand. And so not only was I widowed at 25, but then I also had a baby as well. And so, well, I had an amazing support system, and I did, and I still do. At the end of the day, it is just me. And at the end of the day, it is just me taking care of a child who's not so much of a child. But yeah, it definitely, I definitely was in a state of numb and shockness, for a long time, like a very, like 7 years long. Like it kind of was, I put my head down and do what I have to do in order to, survive for not only myself, but for my child as well.
So it's been 15 years since you lost Lance. What has happened during that period in your and your daughter Kaylin's life? Bring us up to date.
So it's a long time. For the first 7 years, I didn't grieve for the first 7 years. I don't recommend that to anybody. But I didn't grieve for the first 7 years. And so, it wasn't until my daughter was in grade school, where I guess you could say I hit a proverbial wall, I guess you could say. And it was around that same time where I found Threads of Life. And I am someone that kind of just jumps all in, not thinking of what that could possibly do to a person. And so there was a lot of heavy duty counseling involved of working through what it was like losing someone at a young age, what it was like losing someone suddenly, unexpectedly, and what that does to you mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And so, for that first 7 years, it was my body that held me up while the rest of me wasn't doing so well. And when I crashed and burned and had to spend several years getting healthy, because I'm not an emotional person in general at all. And so I had to learn to be emotional. And on top of that, I had a kid who then was coming along and noticing that, wait a second, this isn't normal. I did have a dad. Right. And so in that process of me dealing with my emotions, my kid was hitting an age where suddenly that became a soul focused all over again. And for Caitlin, I'm a little bit more, although she has given me more permission to speak more openly about her, and her own struggles. It's a more complicated grief for my kid. She is growing up not knowing her dad. And so she goes based solely on stories and pictures, and the other side of grief that a lot of people don't talk about is the secondary losses that you lose from grief. Like, you don't just lose the person, right? You lose friendships, you lose relationships, you lose all these other things on top of losing the person that meant the world to you. And so as my daughter has grown and has wanted to know more stories of her dad, the people that are in the picture now, have given her all the stories they have to share. And so she has this desperate desire to know who her dad is and any connection that she can get. And so her grief is a more complicated one. She'll go from one extreme to the other, for herself. And our relationship at times is incredibly rocky. At times, I think that there is some resentment there, that I'm here and he isn't. And those feelings that play in your head, and then you start to believe things that aren't true. The joys of having a teenager now who's 15. Mm-hmm. And so it was a lot more harder, as well as we move through those waves and those days. Versus for myself, I am definitely a lot more healthier mentally, and maybe not so much physically, but mentally and emotionally healthier than I have been in 15 years. I do credit that to 5 years of heavy duty counseling, and I do credit that to the Threads of Life organization, as well. I love going around and speaking to people. I love hearing people's stories, and if I can change one person's mind about the importance of safe work, then I've done my job. We don't want another person to go through, and definitely for my kid as well, who is a lot more aware. She's a little bit more involved now. it bothers her greatly when she hears of another incident and another death on the job, and especially if they have a family and what that looks like and stuff, especially if she hears that the person is pregnant, and that is a trigger, for her, as well. And so it's been a rocky, like I definitely won't sit here and say it's been sunshine and roses, for 15 years. But there definitely has been more, pros than cons. I guess I look for the more pros than cons. I've had to rebuild. I've had to rebuild my life from the ground up, and I've had to rebuild it alone. And so it has been no easy task. It's draining. Solo parenting is not for the faint of heart, and parenting a child who has trauma and grief. And on top of that, a couple of years ago, she was also diagnosed with high functioning autism on top of that, a couple of years ago. And so we've been having that curveball thrown at us as well as we adjust to what that looks like, especially as she gets older. And so that, learning that adjustment too, that there definitely is days where I would like things not to be such a drastic roller coaster. And so it definitely hasn't been smooth sailing. But definitely in the last several years has been, at least for myself personally, has been far more better, mentally and emotionally than it had been, at the beginning. It takes a toll, losing someone suddenly. I mean, grief is grief and loss is loss, but when you lose someone suddenly and unexpectedly, it's a whole different ballgame than other griefs, right? It's whatever that last conversation is. It's whatever that last memory it is, whatever that last, right? And especially when you don't have the answers. I've had to had to come to terms with a lot of stuff that I'm just never going to know. I'm not going to know why. Right. And the whys are going to make you lose your ever loving mind. And so I've had to come to terms, and which is a lot harder for my daughter, who is a very, black and white child, like her dad. And so she needs those answers and doesn't understand why you can't have them. Versus for myself, I've had to come to terms that you're just not going to know. You're not going to, I can't have the answers. I don't know the answers. The only person that can answer a lot of those questions isn't here, to answer them. And I've had to come to terms, which isn't an easy thing to come to terms with that. And I've had to come to terms with, I may not get all my memories of that period of my life back as well. And I don't know if I want to, either. People say some of the stupidest things when someone is grieving, and especially when someone is young and grieving. But there definitely are days that I wish I could remember more of that period of my life, or what I did or said. But yeah, it's been a little bit more of a harder journey through the years, for sure, but rewarding at the same time.
We've done a number of podcasts on the construction industry. We also did one on what we call storm chasers, or individuals here in our province who work as linemen. So they go every time there's a major storm in the U.S., they will go down to, mid to southern U.S., and they will work down there, and they will work days, typical days, probably 14 to 16 hours. So working long days is an issue. It's an issue in a lot of industries. And the topic has been brought up a number of times in our podcast about concerns that I think everybody has when people work such long hours. And of course, the more you do it, the more tired you get. How do you feel that really contributed to your husband's death? And what advice would you like to share with our listeners today, and what to do about working long hours to help them deal with that?
I definitely think it was a contributing factor. I am careful to say it was the main factor of his life being lost that day, but definitely plays a contributing factor. I don't think he would have made the choices that he made that day had he been thinking clearly. Whether that is related to fatigue, whether it is related to, just rushing to get it done. He would much rather have been doing the baby registry with me that day, right? His mind was elsewhere that day, which I think also doesn't help the situation as well. I think the biggest thing is, especially for younger workers, I think, I mean, for anybody, but for those younger workers, is the clear understanding that you have a right to say no. And I think we have this misconception, and maybe not necessarily a misconception, but a belief that have run through the construction industry, that if you say no, you'll lose your job. Or if you say no, and especially for those younger guys, the understanding is that you can, and that your life is important, and your safety is important. And if you don't feel safe doing something, then say no. Whether it is, I'm not trained in that area. I just worked a 17-hour day and I need a day to sleep, or I need a day to be resting with my family, which I realize is a harder thing to do. I realize it's a lot easier for me to sit here and say, just say no. But I think it plays a role. I think we have this idea that we can't, or that we'll lose our job, or lose our placement, or be made fun of, or be pressured other ways. Lance shouldn't have gone to work that day. He really shouldn't have gone to work that day, for multiple reasons. And unfortunately, he felt that he couldn't say no. And we had that argument on multiple occasions, and he just kept on saying, well, when I leave this job, I'll say something. When I leave this job, I'll say something. Well, obviously, that didn't happen. And so I think, at least the frustration and the concern for myself is, you have a right to say no. And we have a moral obligation too. If you see something that is unsafe on the job, or really anywhere, and we don't say something, we are just as much at fault as the person who is making the mistake to begin with. And not only then are you putting yourself at risk, but you're putting the people around you at risk as well. And I do think complacency plays a role too. I don't just think exhaustion plays. I mean, that is a part of the role, but I think complacency is too, right? We skip things, we cut corners, even in our everyday life, because nothing happened. Well, who's to say that 105th time something isn't going to go terribly wrong, and either you're going to lose your life, or someone you know is going to, or someone's going to be injured, or someone you know is going to be injured. And I often say in presentations and stuff right now, that is not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's a matter of when. And it's a matter of when that it's going to happen to you, or it's going to happen to somebody that you know. And so, just like every day, I mean, I live with chronic fatigue. It's a constant battle. It's one of the autoimmune disorders that I got following my husband's death. One of the many health issues that I have been battling with. And so I understand the feeling of constantly being tired, fatigued all the time. And so even for myself, it's learning of the boundaries within myself of what I can and cannot do. There are times I probably shouldn't be behind a wheel of a vehicle. There are times that I am much too tired and can't be out and do things. And so I think, as a culture in a society, we have to learn to say no, and not today. And that truly fatigue will play a role. It may not be the sole role or the sole reason for something happening, but I think it will be one of the many reasons. And so my encouragement is, you just, it's okay to say no. And your life is important, and everyone has a right to go home at the end of the day.
I often do workshops, and during the workshops, I always encourage people to have a discussion at the supper table, dinner table, whatever, about health and safety, especially when it comes to young people, but in a general sense. If you were talking to a group of people about having that conversation, what advice would you give them? what would you tell them to say to their other family members?
About the importance of workplace safety?
Yeah.
You're not invincible. I think we have, especially for those younger guys, we have this idea that it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen to me. It's not going to happen to us. Case in point, we had that same thought. And so I think we need to move away from this idea that we're not invincible. And like I said earlier, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Something will happen. And if we can move away from this idea of if or it's not going to happen, and we have this idea in our head when it's going to happen, or when it's going to happen to somebody that I know, and not become complacent in that either. No, obviously also not to go around living in fear that something's going to happen. But I think if we have a healthy dose of, in the back of our heads, the importance of not only keeping ourselves safe, but keeping the people that we work with safe, because their lives are also important and they also have families, as well. I think we're going to go so much further. I think in a culture and a society, we have this idea that it's a me first mentality. I'm only here to take care of myself, or my family, which isn't wrong. But I think we need to also be thinking of the people around us too, that it's not just our lives that are affected. And I think that's the idea. Like, so many people are like, well, it wouldn't bother us because we'd be gone, right? Or I'm sure we've all heard that saying before, or people have commented that. It's a ripple effect. Grief has a ripple effect. It's not just the immediate people's lives that are forever altered. It's the people that were there that day. It's coworkers. It's family members. It's friends. It's the companies. It's everybody's lives are forever altered by either a workplace fatality or injury. And so I think, I think to get into the idea that you're not invincible and that life is short. Live every day like it's your last day. Life is short as well. You never know. And anybody that understands sudden and unexpected loss lives their lives in a very different way than people that don't. We know what it's like to have to live without that. We know what it's like to lose something so quickly, and we know what that's like. And so oftentimes your perspective changes. It's a big talk in our household, obviously, and not to say that I never noticed when I heard about a fatality or an injury in the workforce beforehand, but it definitely is more of an impact since losing my husband, that it often comes back. It is often aware, especially if it involves a crane. It's definitely a topic of conversation, right? It's a very different world than what you lived in before, when it becomes the sole focus of why your life was forever altered. So yes, I would encourage them that you're not invincible, and don't think that you are.
You mentioned earlier that you've been involved with Threads of Life. How have they helped you deal with the loss of your husband?
I could talk for hours about Threads of Life. Threads of Life is a fantastic organization. I found them. I always get the year wrong all the time, so I just keep tacking on years because I swear I've been with them forever and it's amazing. But I found them about 6 or 7 years ago, kind of around the same time that I started on my journey of healing with counseling. They are a fantastic organization. It was really nice, is really nice to be around other people that get it. That you can walk into a room and not have to explain things. When you say you're okay, they know that you're not. And so to be around other people that have lost a spouse, to be around other people, I've learned a lot. I've learned a ton. Just sitting with people who have workplace injuries. It's a very different life to live than those of us that have fatalities. just as important, really. I think we have this idea that one is worse than the other, but both are life altering. And so to have this organization that came along and that understood, I jumped in with both with both feet. I went to my first family forum by myself, which was a daunting task. 6 years ago, and kind of went from there. I've been involved with speakers bureaus, and so for the last 6 years, I go around speaking to construction companies about the importance of workplace safety. About how a workplace fatality completely altered my life. I'm not the same person I was at all. Although I have to say I kind of like the me now than the person back then, which makes a difference. And from there I joined and support with their volunteer family support guides who come alongside someone else who is grieving. And so I've worked with other widows and I've sat with other widows, which is where my heart truly is. Well, I had the most amazing support system. Couldn't have done it without my family, especially my family. Couldn't have done it, especially without my mom and my brother, especially. You're still isolated and lonely at the end of the day, even with that amazing support system. And I didn't have that support system at the beginning. And so if I can come alongside another widow, and be there for her to give her something that I didn't have back then, I will. It's an isolating, lonely place to be in. Widows are often ostracized. Widows are often kind of left in the background, and even worse for widowers, really, even worse. And so to have that community with Friends of Life have been huge. They have been amazing help with my kid, with Caitlin as well. Caitlin just went to her first family forum a couple months ago, as well. While she was the only teenager, she was welcomed with open arms. She was like a celebrity in there, and they've all heard about her. And so I thought that was really good for her as well, to kind of hear other people's stories as well, which can be really sad and heartbreaking too. But also I think good for her as well. But they definitely, talking about it, at least for myself, helps a lot. I've gotten so many people that ask, well, isn't it harder? Do you find you can't grieve as well, or that it's prolonged because I'm so involved with Friends of Life? And my answer is no. I find it to be very therapeutic. My story has changed in some ways. Details of it have changed over the years as I evolve, and how my desire of change comes. Not that it isn't important to talk about Lance, because it is. It's vitally important to talk about him and to keep his legacy alive. But my sole desire is that there's so much more to the story, right? Like, it doesn't just end there. It didn't just end the day that Lance died. It didn't, my whole life altered. But there is so much more to the story. I'm more than just a widow. I'm more than just a solo parent. There is more to the story, and my desire to connect the two. Now, when I do speaking engagements, my desire to have that be more about the mental health side of workplaces. The importance of talking about it, the impact it has made, the ripple effects that have since come from that, and my desire to connect both. That has changed over the years. It's more about the what now. The who am I away from the grief and loss has been my biggest question over the last probably 5 years, since the 10th anniversary. The biggest question is, who am I away from that? Who can I be away from that? And how can I connect the two? And so Threads of Life has helped a lot in that connecting, the encouragement to talk about things, the encouragement to work through things, the encouragement to write it out. And I've written about three different blogs for Threads of Life that have gone out in their magazines through that journey in especially the last 5 years. It's been more of a growth in the last 5 years than it has in the whole 15 years. And so Threads of Life has played a massive role in who I am now and who I hope to be the longer. I mean, this is never going to go away. And so, who I hope to be down the road as well.
Well, look, Rebecca, we'd like to thank you very much for joining us on our podcast today. We wish certainly you and your daughter, Caitlin, sort of a good future ahead, and as you continue to deal with the loss. Thank you for being willing to share your story with us. For our listeners today, two great messages from Rebecca as far as the loss goes, as well as Threads of Life and the good work that they do as well. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast today. Stay safe. We will see you next week.